appear when near him. This pleased him very much. End of chapter 26. Robinson and his birds. Chapter 27. Robinson gets fire. Robinson was now pretty comfortable. He had his bower with its chair and table. He had his cave in case of danger. He had his cellar in which to keep his meat. He would sit in the shade near the door of his bower and think of the many things he should be thankful for. But there was one hardship that Robinson could not get used to, and that was the eating of raw food. How fine it would be if only I could parch a few grains of corn in the fire. I could live like a prince, thought he, if I had fire. I would grind some of my corn into flour and make some corn bread or cakes and cook rice. He did so long for roasted meat and determined again to make the attempt to get fire. Robinson was fast losing his idle, thoughtless ways of doing things. He had become a thoughtful and diligent man in the short time that he had been on the island. Trouble and hardship had made a man of him. I must carefully think over the whole matter of getting fire, he said. He had failed twice and was now resolved to succeed. If the lightning would only strike a tree, he thought, and set it on fire. But he could not wait for such a thing to happen, and how could he keep it when once thus obtained? It was clear he must have some way of producing fire when he wanted it, just as they did at home. He thought over the ways he had tried and the one most likely to be successful. He resolved to make a further trial of the method by twirling a stick in his hands. He selected new wood that was hard and dry. He carefully sharpened a stick about 18 inches long, and standing it upright in a hollow in the block of wood, began to roll it between his hands. By the time Robinson's hands were well hardened, it seemed that he was going to succeed at last. But he lacked the skill to be obtained only by long practice. "If I could only make it go faster," he said. "There must be some way of doing this. I believe I can do it. I used to make my top spin round with a cord. I wonder if I could use the cord here." The only cord he had was attached to his bow. He was going to take it off when a thought struck him. He loosened the string a bit and twisted it once about his spindle. Then he drew the bow back and forth. The spindle was turned at a great rate. He saw he must hold one end with his left hand while the other rested in the hollow in the block. With his right he drew the bow back and forth. How eagerly he worked! He had twirled but a few minutes when the dust in the hollow burst into fire from the heat produced by the rapidly twirling spindle. Robinson was too overjoyed to make any use of it. He danced and capered about like one gone mad until the fire had gone out. But that was of no matter now, since he could get fire when he wanted it. He hastened to make him a rude fireplace and oven of stones. He hollowed out a place in the ground and lined and covered it with large flat stones. On one side he built up a chimney to draw the smoke and make the fire burn brightly. He brought wood and some dry fungus or mushroom. This he powdered and soon had fire caught in it. He kindled in this way the wood in his stove and soon had a hot fire. The first thing he did in the way of cooking was to roast some rabbit meat on a spit or forked stick held in his hand over the fire. Nothing Robinson had ever eaten was to be compared to this. "I can do many things now," thought Robinson. "My work will not be nearly so hard. My fire will be my servant and help me make my tools as well as cook my food. I can now cook my corn and rice." Chapter 27. Robinson gets fire. Chapter 28. Robinson makes baskets. Robinson still continued anxious about his food supply when he could no longer gather it fresh from the fields and forest. Corn had again become ripe. He had found in a wet, marshy place some wild rice plants loaded with ripened grain. As he now had fire, he only had to have some way of storing up grains, and he would not lack for food. He knew that grain stored away must be kept dry and that he must especially provide against dampness in his cave or his bower. If he only had some baskets, these would be just the thing, but how was he to get them? Robinson had never given a thought to either material or the method of making them. He, however, was gradually acquiring skill and confidence in himself. So far he had managed to meet all his wants. He had invented tools and made his own clothes and shelter. And now, he said to himself, I will solve the new problem. I must first study the materials that I have at hand. He remembered the splint market baskets in which his father took vegetables home from the store. He recalled how thin the splints were woven. They went over and under, he said. That is simple enough, if I had the splints. He set himself diligently to work to find a plant whose bark or split branches could be used for splints. He tried to peel off the rough outer bark of several trees in order to examine the inner layers of soft, fibrous material. He found several trees that gave promise of furnishing abundance of long, thin strips, but the labor of removing the bark with his rude, imperfect tools was so great that he resolved that he would have to find some other kind of material. Why need the strips be flat? He thought. I believe I could weave them in the same way if I used the long, thin, tough willow rods I saw growing by the brookside when I was returning from my journey. He found on trial that the weaving went very well, but that he must have strong, thick rods or ribs running up and down to give strength and form to his basket. He worked hard, but it was slow work. It was 3 days before his first basket was done. He made many mistakes and was obliged many times to undo what he had accomplished in order to correct some error. And at last, when he had woven the basket as large as he thought was suitable for his purpose, he did not know how to stop or finish the top so as to keep the basket from unraveling. At last he hit upon the plan of fastening 2 stout rods, one outside, the other inside the basket. These he sewed firmly over and over to the basket with a kind of fiber from a plant he had discovered that looked almost to be what he had heard called the century plant in the parks at home. On attempting his next basket, he thought long how he might improve and save time. He must hasten, or the now almost daily rains would destroy his ripened wild corn and rice. If I could use the coils of that long grass I saw growing in the marsh beside the rice, he thought, I could make twice the progress. He gathered an armful, twisted it into cables about an inch thick, and wove it into his frame of upright rods instead of the horizontal layer of willow canes. This answered his purpose just as well and rendered the making of large baskets the work of a few hours. He found, however, that the willow rods, or osiers, were not pliant enough to work well in fastening his coils of grass cables together. He tried several things and at last succeeded best when he used the long thread-like fiber of the century-like plant. He had, however, to make a stout framework of rods. He would first coil his grass rope into this frame and then sew it together with twine or thread made from this fiber. He afterwards tried making smaller and finer baskets out of the fiber that he had discovered, which could be easily had from the thick-leaved plant he thought he had seen at home. He first used long, tough, fine roots he had seen when digging up the tree at the mouth of his cave. Afterwards he discovered some tall, tough reeds growing nearby. He laid in a supply of those. He found that when he wanted to use them, a good soaking water made them as pliable and tough as when first cut. The making of the baskets and storing up grains made it possible for Robinson to become a farmer and thus make himself independent. This thought was a great relief to him. Chapter 28. Robinson makes baskets.